Transfer the penthouse and the heirlooms to my name. Eleanor. It's just paperwork, Charles said at their anniversary dinner, as if he were asking her to pass the salt. The words settled over the candlelit table like a quiet storm, polite on the surface and devastating underneath. They had invited 12 friends to celebrate 40 years of marriage in the $2.5 million Manhattan penthouse that overlooked Central Park, the same home Eleanor's father had helped her purchase long before she married Charles. And yet in that moment, she understood that this dinner was not about celebration at all. It was an announcement disguised as a toast. Crystal glasses chimed softly, waiters moved in measured silence, and Charles smiled with the easy confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. We've decided to simplify our estate, he continued, his voice smooth and practiced. Everything will be consolidated under my management. A few guests nodded approvingly, unaware that the penthouse had been in Eleanor's family for 2 generations and that the heirlooms displayed in the glass cabinet by the fireplace, her grandmother's diamond brooch, the gold pocket watch from 1912, the oil painting signed by her great-uncle, were not his to consolidate. Eleanor did not interrupt him. She did not correct him. She lifted her champagne flute and smiled, the same gentle smile she had perfected over decades of charity galas and board meetings, the smile people mistook for softness. Inside, however, she was counting details. She noticed the slight tremor in Charles's left hand when he reached for his glass. She noticed Daniel Reeves, Charles's longtime attorney, standing near the balcony doors with an expression that did not match the celebratory mood. Daniel avoided her eyes at first, then finally met her gaze with something that looked almost like apology. 2 days earlier, Charles had called her into his study and presented a stack of documents, explaining that at 72 he needed clarity in their financial structure. He had spoken about efficiency, about tax exposure, about protecting assets for future transitions. He had not mentioned the young consultant he had recently hired, nor the sudden transfers from their joint account into a new investment entity bearing only his name. Eleanor had read every line before signing, though Charles assumed she would not. She had noticed the phrasing, temporary assignment pending restructuring, but she had also noticed the clause referencing the original source of funds. Her father's trust had not been dissolved. It had merely been referenced. At dinner, as guests laughed and complimented the skyline view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, Charles placed a proprietary hand over hers. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked softly, loud enough for the couple beside them to hear. Eleanor turned toward him, her silver hair catching the warm light from the chandelier. "Of course," she replied, her tone steady, almost tender. What she did not say was that trust and ownership were not the same thing. She let the evening unfold without confrontation. She allowed Charles to believe that his public declaration had sealed the matter. And as the final dessert plates were cleared and the guests gathered their coats, Daniel approached her quietly and murmured, "Mrs. Whitmore, may I speak with you tomorrow morning?" Eleanor held his gaze for a fraction longer than necessary and nodded. Charles mistook her composure for surrender. He did not yet understand that silence, in Eleanor's world, had always been the beginning of strategy. The next morning the penthouse felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor woke before sunrise, the pale winter light stretching across the hardwood floors and illuminating the skyline beyond the glass. Central Park lay still beneath a thin layer of frost, and for a moment she allowed herself to stand barefoot by the window, steady and composed. Charles had already left for an early breakfast meeting, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of his cologne and a folded newspaper on the kitchen island. She poured herself a cup of coffee and reviewed the previous evening in her mind, not with anger, but with precision. His wording had been deliberate. His confidence had been rehearsed. And Daniel's hesitation had not been accidental. At 9 o'clock sharp her phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice carried a formality that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. He requested a private meeting at his office, without Charles present. Eleanor agreed, without asking questions. She dressed in a tailored navy suit she had worn during her years serving on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. The suit she chose when she needed to be reminded of who she had been before marriage softened her public identity. The elevator ride down from the penthouse felt longer than usual, but she did not rush. In the lobby, she acknowledged the doorman with a calm nod and stepped into a waiting town car she had arranged herself. Daniel's office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass building on Park Avenue, understated but prestigious. When she entered, his assistant offered water and closed the door quietly behind them. Daniel did not sit immediately. He remained standing by the window, looking unsettled. He explained that the documents Charles had presented were structured as a temporary transfer for asset consolidation, but he admitted there were discrepancies. The penthouse had been purchased with funds originating from Eleanor's family trust. The heirlooms were listed as marital property only under certain interpretations. He paused before adding that Charles had recently requested expedited processing and had insisted on minimal discussion. Eleanor listened without interruption. She did not accuse her husband. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked one question. Under the original trust agreement, who retained controlling interest if coercion or misrepresentation could be demonstrated? Daniel hesitated, then admitted that the clause favored her. He seemed relieved that she understood more than Charles had assumed. As the conversation unfolded, Eleanor recognized something deeper than legal complexity. She recognized urgency in her husband's actions, as though he were racing against a timeline she had not yet been told about. When she left the office, the air outside felt sharper, clearer. She walked 2 blocks before calling her longtime financial advisor in Connecticut, requesting a comprehensive review of the trust and its protective provisions. She did not feel betrayed in the dramatic sense others might expect. She felt alert. There was a difference. By the time she returned to the penthouse that afternoon, she noticed Charles studying her carefully from across the living room, searching for signs of resistance. She offered him the same composed smile she had given at dinner. He interpreted it as compliance. He did not yet understand that Eleanor was no longer observing from the sidelines. She was gathering facts, and facts had always been more powerful than emotion. That evening Charles suggested they review their estate plan again over dinner, his tone casual, but his eyes observant, as if he were measuring her reaction to every syllable. Eleanor agreed, without hesitation. The dining table that once hosted lively conversations about art acquisitions and philanthropic events now felt like a negotiation table, polished and reflective, revealing more than either of them intended to show. Charles spoke about legacy, about efficiency, about protecting what they had built. He emphasized his experience managing investments, reminding her of market fluctuations and legal complexities. He described the transfer as a practical decision, temporary and beneficial. Eleanor listened while cutting her salmon into precise portions, nodding occasionally, asking only neutral questions that required clarification rather than confrontation. She asked about timelines, about beneficiary designations, about liquidity planning. Each question was delivered with a softness that concealed its purpose. Charles seemed reassured by her composure. He explained that he had opened a new holding company to centralize their assets and mentioned that several transfers had already been initiated. Eleanor registered that detail silently. Later that night, while Charles reviewed documents in his study, she walked through the penthouse slowly. She paused in front of the glass cabinet where her grandmother's brooch rested on velvet, the diamonds catching the city lights. That brooch had survived 2 world wars and a transatlantic relocation. It had never changed hands outside the family. The oil painting above the fireplace depicted her great-grandfather standing beside a modest Connecticut estate, long before Manhattan property became symbolic of status. These were not mere possessions. They were continuity. The following morning Eleanor met with her financial advisor via secure video conference. She requested a complete audit of all recent transfers, including those executed through the new holding entity Charles had referenced. Within hours, preliminary findings began to surface. Several transfers had indeed occurred, but not all were legally irreversible. Some required spousal acknowledgement under New York property statutes. Others intersected with the original trust clause that Daniel had cautiously referenced. The trust, established by her father decades ago, included language that activated protective oversight if asset movement deviated from its stated purpose. Eleanor felt no surge of anger. Instead, she experienced clarity. Charles had assumed that because she had stepped away from daily financial management years earlier, she no longer understood its mechanics. He had forgotten that before marriage she had negotiated gallery leases, evaluated acquisition contracts, and structured endowment contributions exceeding $1 million. That evening when Charles returned from the office, he appeared relaxed, almost triumphant. He asked whether she had considered downsizing in the future, perhaps relocating to Florida where tax advantages were appealing. Eleanor folded a linen napkin on her lap and replied that she appreciated forward thinking. She did not reveal that she had already instructed her advisor to freeze discretionary movement from the trust pending review. Charles misread her calm as dependence. He mistook her silence for acceptance. And as he spoke about restructuring their future, he did not realize that the foundation beneath his assumptions had already begun to shift. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside the penthouse had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Charles began spending longer hours outside the home, claiming strategic meetings and investment consultations, yet he returned each night with a restlessness that betrayed his confidence. Eleanor noticed the small details he overlooked: the second phone placed face down on his desk, the sudden password changes on shared devices, the hushed calls taken near the balcony doors. She did not confront him. Instead, she observed patterns. Daniel called again, this time requesting that she review a supplemental disclosure form Charles had submitted. The form referenced a prospective real estate purchase in Palm Beach, Florida, listed under the new holding company. The projected value exceeded $1 million. Eleanor recognized the urgency now. Charles was not merely consolidating assets. He was preparing for relocation, perhaps even reinvention. That afternoon, she requested a certified copy of the original trust documents from her family attorney in Hartford, Connecticut. The language was precise and unmistakable. Any material reallocation of core assets required dual authorization if the funds could be traced to the founding principal, which in this case was her father. Furthermore, the heirlooms were explicitly categorized as non-transferable cultural property unless voluntarily gifted. Eleanor sat in the quiet living room, sunlight stretching across the Persian rug, and read each clause slowly. There was no ambiguity. Charles could attempt administrative maneuvering, but the legal foundation beneath those assets remained anchored to her lineage. That evening, Charles suggested they host a small farewell gathering for close friends in early spring, framing it as a seasonal change rather than a permanent departure. He described Florida's coastal air and lower taxes with persuasive enthusiasm. Eleanor responded with measured curiosity, asking whether he had finalized the purchase. He answered too quickly, assuring her that arrangements were nearly complete. She saw in that moment not cruelty, but assumption. He believed he had outpaced her understanding. Later, alone in her dressing room, Eleanor opened the velvet case containing her grandmother's brooch and held it in her palm. The weight felt steady, familiar. She remembered the story of its survival through economic collapse and displacement. Her grandmother had once said that wealth was never about numbers alone. It was about stewardship. Eleanor replaced the brooch carefully and closed the case. The following morning, she instructed her advisor to initiate a formal review under the protective oversight clause of the trust, a process that would temporarily suspend disputed transfers pending verification. She did not inform Charles. She did not alter her demeanor. At breakfast, she asked about his schedule and reminded him of an upcoming charity gala. He smiled, relaxed once more, convinced that momentum remained on his side. What he did not realize was that the review process had already generated automatic notifications to associated financial institutions. Quietly, without spectacle, the structure he believed he controlled had begun to pause. The notification arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while Charles was out of the apartment, his absence stretching longer each day as if distance itself were part of his strategy. Eleanor sat at the small writing desk near the living room windows when her secure email chimed. The subject line was simple: temporary suspension of transfer authorization. She opened it slowly, reading each word with the same patience she had applied to every legal clause that week. The protective oversight review had been formally triggered. All major reallocations connected to the original trust were now paused pending verification of intent and compliance. It was not dramatic. It was procedural, and that was precisely why it mattered. She closed her laptop and allowed herself a brief breath, not of relief, but of recognition. The system her father had built decades earlier had done exactly what it was designed to do. Later that evening, Charles returned earlier than expected. His movements were sharper, his tone less composed. He mentioned a minor administrative delay at one of the banks, describing it as routine. Eleanor listened from across the marble kitchen island, hands folded loosely in front of her. Delays happen, she said gently. Financial institutions are cautious these days. Charles nodded, though a crease formed between his brows. He poured himself a drink and stared out at the skyline, perhaps calculating the inconvenience. He did not yet realize that the pause was not accidental. The following morning, Daniel requested another private meeting. When Eleanor entered his office, he appeared more direct than before. He explained that once the trust oversight clause had activated, any attempt to accelerate the Florida purchase would require her explicit reaffirmation. Without it, the holding company's leverage would weaken. He spoke carefully, but the implication was clear. The momentum Charles relied upon had slowed. Eleanor asked whether the review process included an inquiry into the origin of transferred funds. Daniel confirmed that it did. She thanked him and left without visible emotion. Back at the penthouse, she moved through each room with quiet awareness. The oil painting above the fireplace remained undisturbed. The velvet cases were still intact. The city beyond the glass windows shimmered under winter light, unchanged by private negotiations. When Charles returned that night, he attempted to steer the conversation toward lifestyle changes, describing ocean views and warmer climates as if they were inevitable. Eleanor responded with mild interest, asking practical questions about logistics and timelines. Inside, however, she recognized the shift. His confidence now carried strain. The narrative he had constructed was no longer seamless. As she prepared for bed, she paused once more before the glass cabinet, her reflection faintly visible beside the heirlooms. She did not feel victorious. She felt aligned. Stewardship required steadiness, not spectacle. And while Charles continued to speak of transitions and consolidation, the very mechanisms he depended on were quietly recalibrating beyond his reach. By the following week, the financial pause began to surface in subtle but unavoidable ways. Charles received a formal notification from the holding company's compliance department requesting additional documentation to validate the asset consolidation. The letter was polite, almost clinical, but its implications were significant. Eleanor observed his reaction from across the living room as he read it twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened, though he attempted to dismiss it as procedural caution. He mentioned regulatory oversight, shifting banking standards, the usual explanations executives offer when momentum slows. Eleanor listened quietly, knitting in her lap as though the conversation concerned someone else's portfolio. What Charles did not know was that the oversight review had already prompted a secondary audit. The trust administrators had identified discrepancies between the declared purpose of the transfer and the rapid allocation toward the Palm Beach acquisition. Under trust law, intent mattered. If consolidation masked a personal redirection of inherited capital, the structure could be challenged. Eleanor had not requested confrontation. She had requested clarification. The distinction was important. 2 days later, Daniel called again, this time sounding more cautious than before. He explained that the trust administrators were requesting a joint reaffirmation statement. Both parties would need to confirm that the transfer aligned with the original fiduciary purpose. Without Eleanor's explicit confirmation, the transfer could not proceed. Charles paced the living room that evening, phone pressed to his ear as he attempted to accelerate alternative financing for the Florida property. His tone carried urgency he could no longer conceal. Eleanor prepared tea and placed a cup on the side table beside him without comment. He thanked her absent-mindedly, distracted by shifting numbers and delayed approvals. Later that night, after Charles had retreated to his study, Eleanor opened her secure financial dashboard once more. The trust assets remained intact. The heirlooms remained cataloged under non-transferable designation. The penthouse deed, though temporarily referenced in the holding structure, remained legally traceable to her family trust. She felt no surge of triumph. She felt steadiness. The next morning, Charles proposed meeting with Daniel together to streamline misunderstandings. Eleanor agreed with gentle composure. When they entered Daniel's office side by side, Charles spoke first, framing the delays as bureaucratic obstacles. Daniel responded carefully, explaining that fiduciary compliance required Eleanor's informed affirmation. He emphasized the word informed. Charles turned toward her, expectation evident in his expression. Eleanor folded her hands neatly on the conference table and asked Daniel to outline the precise implications of reaffirmation versus revocation. The room grew quiet as he detailed both options. Charles listened, perhaps for the first time recognizing that the decision no longer belonged solely to him. Outside the office windows, Manhattan traffic moved in steady rhythm, indifferent to private recalibrations of power. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply requested additional time to consider her position under the trust provisions. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement. Charles forced a thin smile, but uncertainty lingered in his eyes. In that moment the balance had shifted, not through confrontation but through structure. And structure, Eleanor understood, was far more enduring than persuasion. The meeting at Daniel's office lingered in Charles's mind long after they returned to the penthouse. That evening he was unusually quiet, moving through the living room with the careful restraint of a man recalculating his position. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. He no longer spoke with the same assured rhythm. Instead, he asked measured questions, testing the ground beneath him. "You trust Daniel's interpretation?" he asked while standing near the window, looking down at the city lights. Eleanor adjusted the silk scarf at her collar and answered evenly that she trusted documentation more than interpretation. The statement was not confrontational, yet it carried weight. Charles nodded, though his expression suggested that the simplicity of her reply unsettled him. The following morning he attempted a different approach. Over breakfast he spoke about shared memories, about the early years when they had built their life together. He described the sacrifices he believed he had made, the risks he had taken in business ventures that expanded their wealth. Eleanor listened carefully. She did not dismiss his history. She simply recognized that contribution did not equal ownership when foundational capital predated marriage. Later that afternoon, Daniel sent a revised summary of the trust provisions, clearly outlining that any reaffirmation required voluntary consent free from undue influence. The phrase lingered in Eleanor's thoughts. Undue influence. It was a legal term, precise and unemotional, yet it described the subtle pressure Charles had applied under the guise of efficiency. When Charles returned home that evening, he informed her that the Florida seller was growing impatient. He mentioned potential financial penalties if the purchase did not close on schedule. Eleanor responded by asking whether he had disclosed the pending trust review to the seller. Charles hesitated, then admitted that he had anticipated swift approval. For the first time, uncertainty overtook confidence in his voice. Eleanor did not express satisfaction. She stood by the glass cabinet and adjusted the angle of the oil painting, ensuring it hung perfectly level. The gesture was deliberate. Structure required alignment. That night Charles remained in his study longer than usual, making calls in hushed tones. Eleanor did not attempt to overhear. She prepared a folder containing certified copies of the trust documents, correspondence from the administrators, and Daniel's clarification of fiduciary obligations. She placed the folder inside her desk drawer and locked it. The next morning she requested a formal mediation session through Daniel's office, not as an act of aggression, but as a procedural safeguard. When Charles received notification of the mediation request, he confronted her gently, but firmly. He asked whether she was escalating the matter unnecessarily. Eleanor met his gaze without hostility and explained that transparency protected both parties. The words were calm, almost compassionate, yet they carried a quiet finality. Charles stepped back, perhaps recognizing that the framework he had attempted to control now required her participation at every level. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan moved with indifferent momentum, taxis weaving between lanes, pedestrians crossing streets without hesitation. Inside, the balance of authority had shifted again, not through raised voices but through measured action. Eleanor remained composed, aware that patience, not confrontation, was the decisive instrument. The mediation session was scheduled for the following Friday at 11 in the morning, and in the days leading up to it the penthouse felt suspended between civility and calculation. Charles moved carefully around Eleanor, no longer assuming agreement, no longer speaking in declarations. Instead, he asked measured questions about logistics and timing, as though cooperation might still be restored through tone alone. Eleanor responded with the same composed steadiness she had maintained from the beginning. She did not withdraw affection, but she no longer offered reassurance. On Wednesday afternoon, her financial advisor confirmed that the trust administrators had completed their preliminary review. The findings were clear. The attempted consolidation had extended beyond administrative efficiency and entered the territory of unilateral redirection. Under fiduciary standards, that shift required explicit, voluntary reaffirmation from the originating beneficiary. Eleanor requested that the findings be formally documented and forwarded to Daniel's office before the mediation. She did not dramatize the moment. She simply ensured that documentation preceded conversation. That evening, Charles mentioned that the seller in Florida had issued a final notice. Without confirmed funding, the property would return to the market. His voice carried tension that had not been present weeks earlier. Eleanor folded a linen napkin at the dinner table and asked whether he had considered alternative financing independent of trust assets. Charles hesitated. The holding company's liquidity, it seemed, was not as expansive as he had suggested. The trust had been the foundation. Without it, leverage diminished. Later, alone in her study, Eleanor reviewed the certified copies of her father's trust one final time. The language did not waver. Stewardship was a responsibility, not a convenience. She drafted a brief statement of position for mediation, not accusatory but precise. She would not reaffirm the transfer under current conditions. She would request full transparency of recent financial movements and restoration of the Penthouse deed to its original structure pending mutual agreement. The next morning, Daniel called to confirm receipt of the trust findings. His tone carried a quiet respect. He acknowledged that the oversight clause had functioned exactly as designed. When Charles received notice of the documented findings, he approached Eleanor with visible strain beneath his composure. He asked whether this escalation was necessary. Eleanor met his gaze calmly and replied that clarity prevented future conflict. The words were neither sharp nor defensive. They were steady. On the morning of mediation, Manhattan appeared unchanged, taxis lining the avenue, sunlight reflecting off neighboring towers. Inside the penthouse, the air felt deliberate. Charles gathered his briefcase with controlled movements. Eleanor selected a tailored gray suit and fastened her grandmother's brooch at her collar, the diamonds catching the light with quiet certainty. She did not feel anger. She felt alignment. As they stepped into the elevator together, the silence between them was no longer ambiguous. It was structured, and structure, Eleanor understood, was the one element Charles could not negotiate away. The mediation room on the 32nd floor felt cooler than the penthouse had that morning, the air-conditioned precision matching the tone of the proceedings. Eleanor sat upright at the polished conference table, her hands resting calmly over a leather folder that contained every certified document she had gathered. Charles occupied the seat beside her, though the physical proximity no longer suggested unity. Daniel sat across from them, accompanied by a neutral mediator who reviewed the agenda in measured language. There were no raised voices. There were no accusations. Only structure. Charles began by reiterating his intention to streamline their estate for efficiency and future planning. He framed the Florida acquisition as an opportunity, not a diversion. His words were composed, but beneath them lay urgency. When invited to respond, Eleanor spoke evenly. She acknowledged the value of planning, then referenced the trust findings. She explained that the originating capital had specific protections and that unilateral redirection without voluntary reaffirmation contradicted the fiduciary framework. She did not accuse Charles of deception. She did not question his motives. She focused on documentation. Daniel confirmed the legal interpretation, outlining that without Eleanor's explicit consent, the transfer could not stand in its current form. The mediator asked whether a mutual restructuring could be negotiated. Charles turned toward Eleanor with an expression that mixed expectation and strain. He suggested a compromise in which partial control would shift immediately while the remainder remained under review. Eleanor listened, then asked a single question: whether the Florida purchase had already been contractually obligated under the assumption of full transfer. Charles paused. The silence answered for him. Daniel clarified that preliminary commitments had been made contingent upon funding approval. Eleanor absorbed the information without visible reaction. She then stated, calmly and without hesitation, that she would not reaffirm the transfer under the present circumstances. The room fell still. Her tone was not hostile. It was definitive. She requested restoration of the Penthouse deed to its original trust structure and a complete accounting of all recent financial movements. The mediator recorded the statement. Charles exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that momentum had shifted beyond recovery. He attempted to reframe the matter as a misunderstanding amplified by legal caution, but the documentation spoke with greater authority than persuasion. The session concluded with formal acknowledgement that the transfer would be suspended pending restoration procedures. As they exited the building together, Charles walked slightly ahead, his posture no longer assured. Outside, Manhattan traffic flowed with indifferent continuity, yellow taxis weaving between lanes as pedestrians crossed without hesitation. Eleanor adjusted her gloves and stepped onto the sidewalk with steady composure. She did not feel vindicated. She felt aligned with the structure that had always been hers. In the quiet of the car ride home, Charles remained silent, perhaps recalculating paths that no longer depended on her compliance. Eleanor looked out at the skyline she had known for decades and understood that the shift had become irreversible, not through confrontation, but through refusal. The restoration process began the following Monday with a series of formal notices delivered to the holding company, the bank, and the title registry. Eleanor did not witness the paperwork directly, but she received confirmation from Daniel that the deed reference to the penthouse had been flagged for correction. The language in the notice was precise. Pending review had transitioned to restoration in accordance with fiduciary protection. Charles remained outwardly composed, though his movements carried an edge of restraint. He spent hours in his study speaking with financial contacts, attempting to secure alternative funding for the Florida purchase, but each path appeared narrower than before. Without the trust assets as collateral, leverage diminished significantly. Eleanor maintained her routine without alteration. She attended a luncheon at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation, spoke briefly with a museum curator about an upcoming exhibition, and returned home before sunset. The normalcy of her schedule contrasted with the quiet unraveling of Charles's assumptions. That evening Daniel called once more, requesting a brief joint acknowledgement to finalize the restoration. Eleanor agreed to meet at his office the next morning. Charles joined reluctantly, his posture controlled but visibly restrained. In the conference room, Daniel presented the revised documentation. The penthouse deed would revert fully to its original trust structure. The heirlooms would remain cataloged under non-transferable designation. Any future restructuring would require documented, voluntary consent from both parties under clarified fiduciary guidelines. Charles reviewed the document slowly, perhaps recognizing that the leverage he once believed secure had dissolved through process rather than confrontation. When Daniel asked for signatures, Eleanor signed first, her handwriting steady and deliberate. Charles followed, though his expression revealed the weight of recalibration. There were no dramatic exchanges, no raised voices. Only acknowledgement of structure restored. As they exited the building, Charles paused near the elevator bank and spoke quietly, asking whether she had ever intended to oppose him so directly. Eleanor met his gaze and answered with calm clarity that she had intended to protect what was entrusted to her. The distinction lingered between them. Back at the penthouse, the skyline shimmered beneath a pale afternoon light. Eleanor walked through each room with quiet awareness, noting that nothing physical had changed, yet everything had shifted. The oil painting above the fireplace remained perfectly aligned. The velvet cases inside the glass cabinet were undisturbed. The trust, once presumed malleable, stood intact. Charles moved through the space more cautiously now, perhaps aware that persuasion alone no longer dictated outcome. Eleanor did not celebrate. She did not confront. She simply resumed her place within the structure that had always belonged to her. In the absence of spectacle, authority had returned to its foundation, not through force, but through documentation that refused to bend. In the weeks that followed, the penthouse regained its familiar rhythm, yet the dynamic within it had irrevocably changed. Charles no longer spoke in declarations. He spoke in suggestions, careful and measured, as though recalibrating a strategy that no longer rested on certainty. The Florida purchase dissolved quietly when financing failed to materialize. The seller relisted the property without comment, and within Manhattan's financial circles the matter faded into background conversation. Eleanor did not reference the outcome. She attended her foundation meetings, hosted a small luncheon for a visiting curator, and maintained the same composed presence she had cultivated for decades. Yet beneath the routine, she recognized a deeper shift. Charles spent more evenings reviewing personal accounts, restructuring smaller investments that did not intersect with the trust. His conversations were shorter, his confidence more reserved. At dinner one evening he acknowledged, without accusation, that he had underestimated the legal structure surrounding the original capital. Eleanor listened and replied only that clarity prevented confusion. It was not a rebuke. It was a statement of principle. Daniel later confirmed that the restoration documentation had been fully processed and archived. The trust administrators closed the oversight review with formal notation that fiduciary integrity had been preserved. Eleanor placed the final confirmation letter inside her desk drawer beside the certified copies, not as a trophy, but as record. One afternoon, she found Charles standing before the glass cabinet, studying the heirlooms with an expression she had not seen before. It was not resentment. It was recognition. He remarked quietly that he had never fully understood the historical weight behind those objects. Eleanor stepped beside him and explained the lineage of each piece, the stories passed down through generations, the resilience embedded in gold and canvas. There was no triumph in her tone, only continuity. Charles listened without interruption. The absence of confrontation seemed to settle something between them, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. The penthouse windows reflected the city skyline as autumn approached, the leaves in Central Park shifting from green to muted amber. Time moved forward, indifferent to private recalibrations of authority. Eleanor understood that stewardship required vigilance, but not hostility. She had not dismantled Charles. She had restored balance. And in that restoration, she found a steadiness deeper than victory. Charles no longer mistook composure for compliance. He no longer assumed that persuasion outweighed documentation. The structure stood intact, not as a symbol of control, but as a reminder that alignment, once clarified, does not require spectacle. In the quiet evenings that followed, the penthouse felt less like contested ground and more like anchored space, secured not by dominance, but by deliberate refusal to relinquish what had never ceased to belong to her. Winter settled over Manhattan with a quiet certainty that mirrored the steadiness Eleanor now carried within herself. The skyline beyond the penthouse windows glittered beneath a pale December sun, unchanged in its grandeur, yet subtly altered in meaning. The restoration of the trust had not ended her marriage, nor had it erupted into dramatic separation. Instead, it had clarified boundaries that should never have blurred. Charles moved through the apartment with a new awareness, no longer assuming authority over what had never been exclusively his. Their conversations became more deliberate, less strategic. They spoke of schedules, of foundation events, of charitable commitments, but never again of unilateral consolidation. One evening, as snow began to fall lightly over Central Park, Eleanor stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows and reflected on the weeks that had reshaped her understanding. She had not needed to argue. She had not needed to accuse. She had relied on structure, documentation, and patience. The trust her father established decades earlier had functioned as both safeguard and lesson. Stewardship required vigilance, not confrontation. Later that night, Charles approached her with a quiet sincerity that felt different from persuasion. He admitted that he had allowed ambition to blur judgment. He acknowledged that in his urgency to secure a new chapter, he had overlooked the foundation upon which their life had been built. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he finished, she responded simply that partnership required transparency, and transparency required respect. The words were calm, but they carried weight. In the days that followed, Charles began redirecting his focus toward rebuilding trust rather than reallocating assets. He withdrew from speculative investments and attended a foundation meeting at Eleanor's invitation, listening as she discussed an upcoming scholarship initiative funded by the very trust he had once attempted to consolidate. The heirlooms remained in their cabinet, not as trophies of victory, but as symbols of continuity. The oil paintings still hung above the fireplace, perfectly aligned. The penthouse, valued at $2.5 million, stood unchanged in brick and glass, yet transformed in significance. It was no longer a contested asset. It was anchored ground. Eleanor understood that silence, when paired with knowledge, was not weakness. It was strategy. She had allowed the system to speak where emotion might have failed. And in doing so, she had preserved not only property, but dignity. As the year drew to a close and holiday lights shimmered along Fifth Avenue, Eleanor felt no need for triumph. She felt alignment. The structure remained intact. The trust endured. And within the quiet of the penthouse, beneath the steady glow of the city, she stood not as someone who had fought, but as someone who had refused to relinquish what had always been hers.